He's pardon me. Say it again. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So without any further ado or blarney on my part, I'd like to introduce Michael Murphy.
Thanks, Pete. I like it that Pete talked about me talking about being about the book, which means I guess I better keep it in the book here today. My name is Michael Murphy. I'm an alcoholic. Really nervous today coming in. You know how in a meeting you're waiting for your turn, so you're thinking about what you're going to say. I was really, I've never really planned on what I'm going to say when I speak. I have a few thoughts, usually be the day before or something. But for some reason today, I was like, know this, know that, know this. And so I'm just going to ask God to help me because I don't know. My first sponsor, Sam, used to say to me, he says, you think you know why you're going somewhere, but you don't know why you're going somewhere. So he also said, the first time I spoke at a meeting here, I called him back in California, and he said, well, just remember, there is one person there that needs to hear you. You wouldn't be there if somebody didn't need to hear something from you. So just understand that not everybody there needs to hear you, but there is somebody there. So I'm hoping that that whoever that is can hear what they need to hear today. I got to my first meeting in Los Angeles out in the San Fernando Valley because I was having lunch with a woman who I didn't know was in the program. And for some reason, we were having lunch at Denny's on Sunset Boulevard. And we were part of a theater group, and we were talking about the theater group. And for some reason, I said, I think I have a drinking problem. And she looked at me, she kind of smiled she said, well, she said, I have 15 years of sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'd be happy to take you to a meeting if you'd like to go. And this is the first miracle in my life, was that I said, I don't think I would have brought it up if I didn't think I needed help. And I actually went to that meeting with this person. If you'd known what a defensive person I was before I got here, and even since I've been here, I don't ask for people to help me. I'm going to figure it out myself. And if you try to help me, I'm going to shut you down because you don't know what I'm going through. And I can figure it out if you just leave me alone, right? But had been about 3 weeks since I had an incident where I was working as an actor amongst the famous and semi-famous in Hollywood. And I was in a show from back in the way back called LA Law. And I was playing a defense attorney on that show. And the night before I went to work, I was in one of my usual situations where it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I was still drinking and writing country western songs. And it didn't seem to me like that was an odd thing. And I do remember thinking as I was trying to get some sleep, I thought, well, that probably wasn't the best idea. And I woke up, I had to be on the set at like 6 o'clock to get makeup and that sort of thing. And I was not in good shape. And it really hit me when I was working there, because actually the situation was not too different. That when you work on those shows, you have the jury, and you guys are right in that jury position, right? And so you have to hit all these different marks that they put on tape on the floor when you're making all of your defenses and that sort of thing. And you have to hit them exactly so the camera's in focus. And I just remember feeling like I was glass and I was going to shatter at any moment. And like I was walking this tightrope in between these things, and I was trying to control the shakes, and it was a nightmare. And actually, about 6 months ago, I was on the internet, and every once in a while, my ego gets the better of me, and I'm like, I wonder if I'm still out here on the internet. And I pulled up that episode of LA Law, and I watched myself, and I went, wow, you can't tell. But I wasn't there. Do you know what I mean? There was a body moving and it was holding on for dear life, but I wasn't there. I never had tried to stop drinking. I never, ever tried to stop drinking. I was only ever going to just control this thing one more time. It's why when Pamela, the woman who took me when I first meeting, took me there, they read more about alcoholism like we do in this meeting. And that saved my life. It had never occurred to me that anybody else had been doing what I'm doing, trying every conceivable way to keep ahead of this thing and to make sure that no disasters happen. My drinking, unlike a lot of people, was a kind of reverse pyramid. It was like most people, it seems like you started easy and then the big horrible things happened at the end. Mine was more like the big horrible things happened at the beginning. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'll control this stuff and I'll move to the next thing. And okay, that's another disaster. And I kept limiting my life and limiting my life and limiting my life until by the end, I was sitting at home writing really bad country western songs and drinking a lot. But that night, they read that and I just went, oh my God, that's me. I didn't realize that that was kind of the second miracle that had happened is I immediately identified with you people here. And it seemed to me that it was really clear. It was like, okay, I guess the jig's up. I guess this is it. And then they had two speakers at that meeting, that a short speaker and a longer speaker. And I don't remember the short speaker. I remember more about alcoholism. The main speaker was a woman who was probably at that time about 65 years old, and I had nothing in common with her. And I don't remember anything about her story except her talking about being in a hotel room by herself alone, drinking at the end, and that she had never known that much loneliness and disconnection. And I went, oh my God, that's where I'm at. I never even thought of the word loneliness in relation to me, because I'm the kind of guy who's going to tell you how it is. I'm going to show up. I'm going to be there. Everything's okay. And, but I went, oh my God, I've been out, like I'm on an island alone here, alone, alone, alone. And that saved my life. So we finished the meeting and Pamela said, well, how did you like it? And I said, it was kind of amazing. I said, and she said, well, what about the God stuff? And I said, well, that's a deal breaker. And she said, well, don't worry about it. Just, you could have the group as a higher power, the things we say in here. And I've told this story, and it's been the same from the first time I've said it. But the older I get, the more I can't believe this is really what happened. But I'll just say it again because this is what happened. I got in my car and I sat down, and there was a voice next to the rearview mirror, and it said, so how's it going? And it was a real voice in the car. And I said, it's fucked. It's completely screwed. And I just started sobbing. And I've known a lot of self-pity in my life. If that wasn't self-pity, I was really just so relieved, completely relieved. It was like, okay, I just don't have to carry this stuff around anymore. I'm just so tired of carrying around the burden of being Mike. And looking back on it, I realized I think I'd done in a weird sort of way the first 3 steps in that evening. I'd come in and I'd realized that I was powerless over alcohol, that my life had become completely unmanageable. I'd come to believe through you guys that there was something greater than me that could, I don't know about restore me to sanity, but give me some sanity. And when I got in the car, if we do this film, by the way, of my life, it will be a comedy at this point, because me driving home sobbing because I've seen the light is really pretty comic. It never feels comic at the time, though, But I had an experience where I turned my will and my life over to you guys that night. And I don't think I was really aware of it, but what had happened then is I was actually willing to go to a meeting the next day. And it was at that meeting where some person that I didn't believe told me that all I needed to do was pray in the morning to ask God to help me stay sober and ask him to and thank him at night. And they didn't care whether I believed it or not. And in fact, sometimes they said, you know, the fact that you think you really believe that stuff may be more of a problem than an aid. So just do the action of the praying. Just start getting into this stuff and go to the meetings and don't drink in between. And I did that. Side note, I guess, I was talking to somebody before the meeting and I was saying, you know, I don't ever remember hearing the stories of any of the old guys who were in the meetings I went to. You know, they weren't the ones that were on the speaker circuit in LA. They were like the Supreme Court. They sat in the back row of the room. And they terrified all of us newcomers. And somehow they knew in these meetings, and the guys who ran the meetings were usually kind of 2 to 5 years sober and were on fire with the program, but they knew to call on these guys on a specific order at the end of the meeting. They all had their spiel that they did. And I never heard any of their stories. I guess I did hear from Vern. Maybe I'll talk about Vern later. Vern was the one who was the last speaker, and he always talked about vigilance. It was V for vigilance and Vern, I guess. But I realize I'm one of those old guys now. And I'm like, and I realized that for me in the early days, it really, really was about me and a group of about 5 other guys who I was getting sober with. And we just hung on to each other. And we stayed sober one day at a time, and we called each other. And we were really in touch with what it meant to be new. And in the meetings I went to in LA, they were like 1.5 hour meetings with a smoke break in them. And we'd go out and we'd stand and smoke in the parking lot and just talk about how we were doing. I also realized that we were a different group than this other group. There was a group like us who were like, how are you doing? And we were actually like, have you got a sponsor yet? I haven't, that kind of stuff. And there was another group that was over there that I'd listen to every once in a while. And they were the ones who were kind of like, fuck this stuff, man. This is bullshit. There was a kind of a group in there that was like, and then I heard somebody say, you know, hang with the winners. And I don't think I ever tried to hang with the losers or the winners, but it seemed to me that there were the guys I was with and they seemed to be doing this thing. And it was pretty clear that when I read the book, it was like a big revelation to me. I was like, oh my God, this is like a manual. If I was like a car mechanic and I wanted to learn how to, you know, take apart cars and put them back together again, I'd want a manual that was clear and, you know, like, what do I do? And this is that. And I spent my life in the Lutheran church over in Great Falls, Montana, never really buying the stuff they were selling there. And this to me was like, okay, you mean I don't have to believe anything. I just have to do this stuff. And somehow this is going to work. And they said, yes. That thing about having beliefs that you believe strongly in before you get here, I don't know about your experience. I know there have been some people that I've worked with in AA who've come in and they've had incredible religious background. And they say, you know, I've got a spiritual program. I don't need your spiritual program. I just need you to help me stay sober. And those people, for me, have had a hard time staying sober. And I'm not knocking their spiritual program, but it feels to me like somehow it's like, you know, you need the car manual so that can work for you. And that's what began to happen for me as I began to have experiences by doing the steps that changed the way I perceived my life. I also have had an interesting time in the last few years. I started going to Al-Anon about Oh, so about 4 years ago, just before the pandemic. God, that's longer than that now, maybe. And so I'm this weird kind of hybrid guy now because of course if you have kids and you grow up long enough, you're gonna have to deal with their family alcoholism moving forward. And so that stuff kind of started happening with my daughter and her marriage kind of going south because of the alcoholic in her life. And so some things from my earlier life began to come into focus, which is really interesting. Part of it had to do in terms of alcoholism. Well, a couple stories. I remember talking to my friend Mark, who was not an alcoholic, when I was about 6 months sober. And I said, Mark, what happens when you drink? And he said, well, kind of what we talk about. He said, well, I'll have a couple and then I'll start getting tired. If I drink much more than I don't feel good. And he said, why? What about you? And I said, well, at about 3, I start feeling a little bit more like myself. And it seems that the more I drink, the more I feel like I'm in control. And the more I feel like I'm who I really am. And then I really can't stop. And the thing that's interesting about that is things happen at that point that I wouldn't want to happen, but I'm not in control of. But it feels like I'm in control of. He said, God, man, if that happened for me, I'd drink too. You know? And that helped me because I was like, okay. Because I'd always looked at my uncles. I come from an Irish Norwegian combo family. The Norwegians are mostly over in the West Coast, and I never met them much. But all my alcoholic uncles were in Great Falls, Montana, and were notorious. And aunts. My Aunt Mary was. I heard stories about my Aunt Mary later. I'm like, oh, really? She really was one of us through her sister, my Aunt Margaret. But these guys were the real alcoholics. One of my uncles died before I knew him, aspirating on his own vomit in the jail cell over in Great Falls. And my uncle Frank was the kind of alcoholic who would, I was on the backyard mowing the lawn one day, and my dad came out because somebody had come to the front porch there, and he was served by his brother Frank, who was suing him because he fell off a scaffolding drunk and broke his arm. And so that was Frank's mode of operation when he was working for my dad. I wasn't like those guys, but I had that thing that happened where somehow I felt more comfortable drinking than I did in reality. One of the reasons I became an actor, I realized, is because I actually felt more comfortable on stage than I did in reality too. I grew up with a family, and dad was, he never said he was an alcoholic, but I'd have my conversations with my mom telling me about what he was doing and me saying to her, why don't you leave him? And her saying, no, I can't do that. You know, those kind of conversations. And, but he was a super successful guy. How could he be an alcoholic? He ran one of the biggest construction companies in the West, was always the one who had things in control, not like me. Anyway, we had him, we had my mom, who was sick a lot. She had a seizure kind of situation that would go on, and I'd find her when I came home in bad shape. And I had an autistic blind brother, Jim, who was amazing. He's a date savant. If he'd meet anybody in this room, he'd ask you when your birthday is, and he'd remember it for the rest of his life. He's actually a really cool guy. He's 4 years older than me. He's still alive. He's been through a lot. So I didn't realize that, my life just on the norm at home was pretty out of control a lot of times. I knew how to maneuver my brother because he was a head butter. He'd get upset, and I know exactly how to move furniture in front of him so that he'd hit it before he hit me. I was clever that way. I used to move furniture around on him in various ways just to fuck with him. Yeah, I know. But when I was on stage, it was really interesting because for some reason, when you're in a play and you're there, it's all in your control. You can have a lot of big emotions. You can go through a whole lot of different stuff and it all comes out okay. And I always felt absolutely in control, almost like there was a power greater than myself that had things for us. You know, it was like, okay, we're going to be okay. I felt that way also when I sang in choir. We'd sing, and sometimes we'd sing in choir, and it'd be so amazing the sound of us making that was way more than any of one of us could do on our own. Anyway, God, where did I go with that?
Choir.
Yeah, I know, I was in choir. Anyway, I think that the thing about that stage experience and the drink experience, they were very similar. There were places I felt I was in control until in the drinking I wasn't. And so if I fast forward to that time when I was on that set of LA Law, being completely out of control and completely a nightmare, that really scared me because that was in some ways my safe place. And that led me to Pamela, and led me to you guys, and led me to where I am now. The other thing I was thinking about the other day is I had this realization that the moments I remember really fondly since I've been sober, a lot of them, I'd say about 80% of them were things that were really horrific at the time that I went through in AA, that I got through and made it to the other side. And some of that was going through the steps, but mostly the steps were a relief. I ended up with a sponsor because I was cleaning up and helping set up the meeting beforehand one night. And I was bitching and moaning to a guy there about how my wife was angry because I was going to meetings every night. And she said, I see you less now than when you were drinking. And he said, well, why don't you come to this noon lunch meeting? And this was a power greater than myself. I didn't know there were noon meetings. I was just going to these evening meetings. So that's where I met Sam. And, you know, they say, find somebody who you want what they have for a sponsor. That wasn't it for me with Sam. He was kind of weird little real estate salesman. He was just a strange guy, you know, but he talked to me and I don't know how it happened, but somehow he ended up being my sponsor, you know, and I don't even remember asking him, but I somehow ended up with a sheet of papers and him saying, here's what you're going to do. And I think the great, since I've sponsored a number of guys in AA, it took me a long time to realize that I think Sam really loved sponsoring me. And I think the reason he loved sponsoring me because I was actually willing to do the work. And I realized for me, I'm really not a good sponsor unless somebody's actually willing to do the work. I'm really ineffective at bullying you into doing the work. It has never worked. I've tried. I remember standing with a friend of mine who's now not with us. We were on a walk one morning in summer over in the U District, and it was probably about 8:30 after the morning meeting. And I was screaming at him in the middle of the street, I'm sure waking people up saying, when the fuck are you, excuse me, when are you going to get this? This is killing you. And I said, a lot more than that, you know? And he ended up killing himself on April Fool's Day 2 years later. So it's strange. Anyway, Sam took me through the steps. One of the things about the first step that was interesting to me is that I'd never really thought about denial until I worked the first step. Because even when I was after that first meeting, all the things I said to you were true, but I didn't really remember having that big a drinking problem. But when we sat down and we just started talking about times when my life was unmanageable and my drinking was out of control, And I just had to come up with a list with him. I was like, oh my goodness. This was from the very beginning. You know, it was from the very beginning. Really, the first drunk night I had was with my friends up in East Glacier, sitting in a car with a case of beer with my friend Tom, saying we're gonna get these girls to be with us before the night was out. And they were in a dormitory that we were sitting out of. We never made it into the dormitory, and they never came out of the dormitory. But we sat and got drunk. Tom would kind of go back and forth, I think like a negotiating team, to see if they were interested. They were never interested. But by the end of that night, we'd run my car into the tree behind us. That's because I thought Tom wasn't as drunk as I was, so I gave him the keys. Big mistake. And by the end of that night, I had slid down a hill in a brownout somehow in my sleeping bag and woke up in the morning with my feet in the lake in Lake McDonald there. Awful hangover the next day. The other thing that really hit me at that time, and I think Sam was a strange little guy, but he was also really kind, super, super kind person. And when he told me the stories about how violent he was with his kids and how none of them were speaking to him, even after 8 years of sobriety, I was like, wow. But it did remind me of my violence with my wife when I was drinking. Because I always thought I was really a fun drunk, you know? But then I started remembering the holes in the walls of all the apartments I'd been in. Because I just, underneath all of this was a rage. And I don't know what that was about. I think that kid was pretty scared most of his early life. And I think I was on the defense from the beginning. I didn't get bullied much at school, but that's because I kind of go crazy at people who started bullying me. I'd sneak up behind them and I'd just beat the shit. Excuse me. I would get really angry with them, right? So alcohol let a lot of things out that I just had really just shoved back down that came back out, or that came to the surface when we did the inventory. But having Sam there was a kind of miracle for me. And part of it was because he was so much different than me. It was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm sitting with this person. And I really kind of fell in love with Sam over the time we were together for that couple of years. And Sam's email was yagod at AOL.com. I was and am a really arrogant person, or can be. I was at a meeting at the Providence thing, got about a year ago. And there was a guy in there and he said, I know you. I said, you do? He said, yeah, you sponsor so-and-so who was my sponsor and he was terrible. And I think you're one of the worst sponsors ever, because I was like, and what I could say to him was, yeah, I think I'm pretty arrogant. I got some real problems with attitude at times. What's helped me with that has to do with me realizing that I look at it, I see a lot of arrogant people and I look at them and I go, oh my God, they're as frightened of life as I was. I think the great thing about the steps for me is all of the armor that I built up to be this person that was supposed to end up getting an Academy Award was there just to cover up a ton of fear. And I was going to keep skating on top of that for as long as I could. The other thing that happened for me is it felt like I was also a really talented guy. But there'd come this point where if you're talented, people are going to take you to the next level and they're going to see who's interested in and able to go to the next level. And that's when the drinking really took off. Because for me, at the bottom of that, I think was a feeling that somehow I just couldn't handle it. There was no way I could handle it. And so I drink away jobs, you know. One of the ones, a friend of mine who was a very well-respected writer had a play that she wanted me to audition for, and I read for her, and she said, "That's great. Just come in tomorrow morning and meet the director, and we'll just make this official." I thought, great. So I celebrated, and I'm pretty sure I was writing country western songs that night too. I have a book of them. I should bring them with me and read you the bad lyrics. The next morning I woke up and I thought, man, I'm coming down with the flu. Something's wrong here. And years later, I had the opportunity to make amends to Marcia, this writer, who came to Missoula to do a writers' conference that I was in charge of. And I drove to the airport to pick her up, knowing that I was making the amends for this. And she got in the car and I hugged her and I said, that day, she goes, "What was going on? What happened?" And I told her and she went, "Oh my God, I'm so glad you're sober. Who knew?" She said, "My brother's sober." And I met her brother. It's a weird world if you get sober. It is a strange world. It's a strange world of happenstance. Once I went through the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, was making my amends on the ninth step. I had another experience sort of like that with a girlfriend that I'd been violent with in my relationship with her. And I was talking with her on the phone and I told her I was, and she said, "Oh my God, I'm so glad. We were all so worried about you." I said, "You were worried about me when I was 21? I had no clue." I mean, that's denial. That's denial. I had absolutely no idea that I had a drinking problem until I was 37 or 36. Sam was my first real connection in AA, but the guys in LA were super enthusiastic. And we got into service almost immediately. It was back at a time when there was still a lot of 12-step work being done, you know, getting phone calls. I was on a phone call list. And this is where it's like, what are some of the greatest experiences of your life? This is one of them, which you guys are the only ones who probably understand that. I was rehearsing for an acting class I'd gone to because I finally was willing to admit I needed help. So I started going to an acting class. My wife had been suggesting it for about 10 years, right? But I knew better. So I was in Santa Monica rehearsing a scene, and I got a call from a friend of mine in the program who said, "Okay, there's a guy." It was close to Pasadena where we were going, which if you know LA, that's a long shot. And it was rush hour. And he said, "I'm going there, you go there." He gave me the address and he said, "We'll see who gets there first." And I got on the freeway, and I kid you not, it was like God took the freeways of LA and went, "There's no problem here. You're going to go." Things just moved. I was there in like 20 minutes. Pulled up. The guy was a disaster. He was still drunk. He was throwing up the window as I was taking him to the hospital. They didn't want to take him in, but I hung around long enough. They finally took him into detox. And I finished that and I went, wow, that was a rush. And it was also strange because I'm really not a risk-taking person because I'm really afraid of most things. And so having the idea that somehow there's a higher power and that we're here to do something other than what we're here to do. In other words, my career, all of that stuff is not of any importance. I mean, it has its function. But what that gave me at that point was this sense of like, wow, I just do this stuff. And it was about that time I got a call from my agent saying, this casting director wants to know if you want to work. And I hadn't been really that work worthy of late. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, she's got a job for you. And I said, well, she's got an audition, right? And he said, no, she's just got a job. And that never happened to me before. So I went and I did a short stint on what was Angela Lansbury's show? Murder, She Wrote. Yeah. And then I got another job in Denver, and my sponsor said, you're going to Denver. Well, we got to figure out the meetings in Denver. And this was back way before the internet. And so we're getting, phone books at the library and different things to plan out my trip to Denver. And he said, you think you know why you're going to Denver. You don't know why. There's an alcoholic, somebody in Denver needs to see you sober. That's why you need to go to that clubhouse there. What's the name of that? York Street Clubhouse. So I took 2 buses the first day I got there and went to the York Street Clubhouse, and I went upstairs there and sat in a meeting on a bench in the back, and a guy sat right next to me who was still drunk, and he really reeked of it. And I thought, really? Really? This is it? But the only thing Sam had trained me to do is saying, you're looking for this guy. Here he is. So I turned him and I said, I think we're supposed to meet. And he said, I'm in bad shape. And I said, well, I know, that's why I'm here. I said, do you want to talk afterwards? And I ended up spending the next 3 mornings with him. We'd meet every morning at my hotel, and he'd try to have breakfast. He didn't eat much breakfast. He did a lot of honey and orange juice at that point. But he stayed sober. We stayed in contact for a couple of years after that. So you think you know why you're there, but you don't know why you're there. The other thing that happened in Denver is I talked to my dad, and he'd said, your aunts are from Denver. And I'd never been to Denver before, and I'd never seen the aunts. This is my dad's mom's sisters. And he said, well, you should go see them. There's that place there where there's this street they live in. This is the church where they got married. Your grandfather got married to her. And I said, yeah. Anyway, the second day of shooting, there's a woman there named Annie Golden, and she's working on the thing with me, and she's saying, how are you doing? I said, well, I'm a little crazy because I'm sober and I'm just doing this. She goes, oh yeah, my brother's in recovery. She said, I tell you what, come with us tomorrow. You can just come with us and hang out. But just, you're not shooting, but just come with us. And I said, oh, okay. So I got up the next morning after I'd had breakfast with my friend, and I met them, and I got on the little bus they took to go over to, and we went to the church where they were shooting. It was the Father Dowling Mysteries, this thing back in the day. And we pulled up to the church, and I went, oh, it was the church where my grandfather got married. It was a block away from my aunt's house. It's a weird program. And I sat in that church and I thought, really? You think you know why you're here? You don't know why you're here. I've been really emotional lately. I've been crying a lot lately. And when I'm crying, most of the time, it's when there's some kind of connection that's happening that I so desperately needed from the time I was a kid. And I found it through the program of AA and through working these steps. And the best moments in my life are not what I thought they would be. Some of them are really what you would hope they would be, like seeing my son the first time he performed in New York City, and I got to sit in a theater when he came out and danced, and I was like, how did this happen? So the guys who've heard this story, I'm sorry, I'm going to tell it again, but it just happened lately that I was back in New York, and I haven't been on the stage for many years. I've done directing. I work at the U with the Media Arts program. I do a lot of art installation work with video and different things, and I've had a wonderful life here. But I was back east, and my son ended up through a lot of different things in his life, he works shooting Broadway shows now. He's a photographer. And there's a show he was shooting called Every Brilliant Thing with Daniel Radcliffe. And it's a beautiful show about a guy talking about his struggle with his mom who had multiple suicide attempts. And it's a very moving show about connection and community. And Daniel Radcliffe works with people in the audience. He assigns them lines and he calls out, and people have lines that they share. And so it feels almost like you're at an AA meeting. It feels like a very community kind of thing. And Daniel Radcliffe, my son, said he's the nicest guy on the planet. And I said, well, that's cool. And I was talking to some ladies from Texas before the meeting. And I said, yeah, my son said he's such a nice guy. And they said, well, he's right there. And I turned around, and he was right there. And I said, oh, hi. And he said, yeah, I'm Dan. And I said, I'm Matthew Murphy's father. He goes, oh my God, your son is so amazing. I love your son. And we talked for a minute. And he said, hey, would you mind if I need you? Would you be willing to come up on stage and do something? And I said, you don't want that. And honest to God, my biggest fear is that I will get back on stage and start acting again. And he said, let me think about it. So he went away, and I thought, good, that's done. And he came back about a minute before the show was getting ready to start. He said, please, would you do this for me? Well, what are you going to say? He's the nicest person on the planet. And so I said, sure. And I went to sit down. He said, no, you're not coming there. You're going up there. So it took me up on stage, and the audience, part of the audience sits around a platform on stage that's like this. So it's actually just like this. There's a platform where he's going to perform. There's an audience out here, and there's about this many people on the stage with him. And he walked me and set me right there where you're sitting, right dead center in that. And I was like, oh my God. So he starts to play, and he's working with different people and different things. And he turns around and he says, sir, would you be willing to be my father in this? Yeah. And he came, sat down next to me and said, okay. He said, we're driving to the hospital, and my mom has just had a suicide attempt, but you're not going to play me now. You're not going to play my dad. You're going to play me at 7 years old. So switch seats with me, because this is England and I'm driving. And he said, all you have to do is everything I say, you just ask me why. So I'm sitting next to Daniel Radcliffe in this thing going, and he's talking about things, and I'm just, as a kid, going, why? Why? And it's funny, and it's a whole lot of things. And that's done. I'm like, thank you, God. And anyway, goes on. He gets a woman from the audience to be his girlfriend and fiance, and they get married. And he says, my father, a man of few words, has a toast to say at the wedding. And he comes and he takes the microphone. He walks up to me and takes me onto the middle of the platform on stage and says, from your heart. And he goes, sits down in the audience. And the woman he picked to be his eventual wife in this was an audience member. And I remember he's a very short man. He's probably 5'2". And she was about 6 feet. And she was wearing a kind of funny, kind of almost tutu over her jeans. And I stood here, and I was in that place on the stage, and I thought to myself, please, just be here. Just be here. And I turned and I looked at them in the audience, or looked to the two of them, and I said, when I first saw you two, I just didn't get it. Which I didn't. And I said, but it's amazingly beautiful. I've fallen in love with you. It's a weird program. I don't know. If I think about that moment, falling apart with self-centered fear in front of a television camera in LA. And the moment I just got to have, really because my son is an upstanding, incredible person. And I think this man trusted my son enough to go, this guy's probably okay. The best moments of my life are just not what I thought they would be. I know I'm running a bit late here, so I'll finish this up. I've been able to carry a lot of different things with me in my heart and in my body and in my spirit since I got sober. But all of it comes back to the very simple, and thank you, Pete, for introducing me. Pete's been a real light in my life since he came back into the program, and it's been wonderful. What I live for is seeing the light come on in your eyes. I've not known happiness so much except to be able to see it in you and to see that I'm a part of something that's finally bigger than my own little dreams of conquest. So that's all I've got. And thank you for letting me be here today.